Welcome to the Turnaround Podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. In each episode, Stephen speaks to experienced practitioners who discuss their careers, key moments, challenges, and lessons learned in financial turnarounds and business restructuring. Join us as we unravel the secrets to turning struggling businesses into success stories. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, frilibertas.com. Now, here's the host of the Turnaround Podcast, Stephen Phillips.
Hi, my name is Stephen Phillips. I'm a solicitor based in London and founder of the restructuring boutique law firm Libertas. For our first show, we have a cracking guest, a guru of the restructuring world in Europe, Andrew Wilkinson, who's the co-head of European Restructuring at Weil, Gotshal, the global law firm. I've known Andrew for 20 plus years, and I'm really excited he's going to do this inaugural show for us. Andrew's been doing restructuring for about 30 years, and it's hard to think of anyone in the city who can compare to his experience at the top end of cross-border restructuring deals. It's an absolute privilege to have him on, not least for me to say thank you for giving me a job 20 odd years ago when I relocated back from Asia. So Andrew headed restructuring at the time at Cadwallader, and we'll probably talk about that. But Andrew, I just want to say welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stephen. Look, it's incredibly kind of you to invite me on. I always think that once you start attracting labels like Guru or Hall of Fame, it's a sort of, it's time. It's people giving you a message. It's time to go. So I'll try and play down the Guru and Hall of Fame bit of it. I've also got I've got a surprise for you. It's actually 40 years. So I started as a lawyer about 40 years ago. So we've missed a decade somehow.
So I stand corrected, but I'd actually want to start the discussion with your career, how you got into restructuring, how you made your start, and why you ended up really where you are now. So maybe over to you on that.
Yeah, thanks. So, I'd love, the stories about people who have incredibly well planned careers. Students leave university, they've got a very clear idea of what they're going to do. And other than leaving with a law degree, the one thing I knew I needed to do, I knew I wanted to come to London, but I also knew that I was going to have to make some money. And I started as a barrister, and in those days, pupil barristers were not paid. And my father was completely opposed to this idea of me moving to London and setting out on a London legal career. So there was absolutely no funding, and I was just broke. I spent everything I had at university, run up considerable debts, bankrupt my girlfriend, now my wife, and I needed to get a paid job. So I applied to the five, what we now call magic circle firms. And in those days, I think the truth is it's probably a bit easier to get in. So I got offers from all of them, and I basically went to the one that was paying me the most money, and started as a corporate lawyer at Clifford Turner, the firm that became Clifford Chance. And then everything unfolded from that, and it was a series of unforeseen events that led me 40 years later to doing this podcast. So not sort of terribly well planned. And I think out of those 40 years, it kind of breaks into more or less 4 chunks of 10 years. And I did actually a little bit more than 10 years at Clifford Chance, became a partner when I was 28, at the unimaginably early age of 28.
That's very young. Yeah.
Somehow I managed to persuade them to. Well, I think that the truth is they needed a partner that was prepared to do what we then called insolvency work. So I said, sure. So it was just over 10 years at Clifford Chance, then the Cadwallader years, then Goldman, and then Weil Gotshal. So I've had a sort of period out as a banker. And I think the honest truth is that since pretty much the first day I arrived at Clifford Chance, I've sort of been peddling more or less the same idea, being completely honest about it. When I walked into to Clifford Turner, working with still a friend of mine, actually, a partner who was Australian and left pretty much as soon as I became a partner. He left and went into the house building business on the west coast of the States, which is a different story. But the thing that he was working on was a pool of Bermudian reinsurance companies, super complicated, needed to be restructured. And somebody had, not me, but somebody had come up with the idea of doing it through a scheme of arrangement. And so the first day we were working on the scheme arrangement, everyone said, no, you can't do it. It's, there's problems that, as long as you're armed, no one uses schemes anymore. And that idea has stood me, with some adjustments, in remarkably good stead for 40 years. So I guess I sort of grabbed that and then shamelessly recycled it over the years when the need arose to have some sort of restructuring tool. So that's the thing in a nutshell.
What brought you out of very established UK firm into Cadwallader, which is a very storied US firm or a New York firm, but I doubt whether anyone had really heard of it in London. It must have been a real leap in the dark at that point in, I guess, the late 90s.
Yeah. So first of all, the kind of reason why I got interested in that was, again, a sort of complete accident. So what happened in London, one of the things that happened in London at the beginning of the 90s was that the London insurance market, which was split into the corporate market and then Lloyd's, slowly and then suddenly basically went bust. And the thing about the London insurance market work was that although the entities were in London, the creditors were policyholders or reinsured companies, and they were all in the States. The London insurance market and Lloyd's traded extensively in the States, issued lots of policies. So the creditors, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them, of probably what were, I don't know, maybe 20 companies that had gone bust in London. The creditors were in the States, and central to the restructuring of those insurance companies was doing something in the States. So we dusted off the scheme. What we need is a scheme of arrangement, and everyone goes, oh yeah, that sounds a good idea. Let's do one of those things, really having no idea how it would apply to insurance companies. And then we needed a process in the States. And the process then, was the predecessor of Chapter 11, was Section 304 of the Bankruptcy Code. So I found myself spending a lot of time in the States negotiating with the creditors of these insurance companies, who were formed into committees, and they had lawyers. And we were working with, it was either Chadbourne and Park or Sherman and Sterling, doing the kind of US end of these deals. And I found myself spending more and more time in New York and thinking, this is pretty interesting. And it would be a good idea if, by this stage, Clifford Chance acquired a bankruptcy practice in New York. That could be incredibly interesting. And unfortunately, in those days, we just couldn't make the numbers work. I mean, I think the firm was pretty interested in the idea of doing something in New York, but we just weren't going to be able to pull off then a merger with the kind of firm that, I think I thought and the banking partners thought, would make sense in the, mid 1990s. And it's sort of, if I couldn't persuade a team of bankruptcy lawyers to come to Clifford Chance, I thought, I'll go and work for the Americans. I wasn't part of a team. It was very much sort of off my own bat. I got an approach from Cadwallader, who were a big insurance and insolvency firm with a business run by my very good friend Mitch Sonkin, and Mitch persuaded me to join Cadwallader. There probably is a story about the move, because, as you say, in those days, very few partners had moved to US firms. I think I was highly likely to be the first restructuring lawyer to move, and probably one of the very first partners to move into a US firm. And it's difficult to describe how difficult that and contentious that process was. And we could talk quite separately. It's a long and involved story, but in those days, moving from the partnership is for life in a London firm to a US firm was extremely unusual. And I had absolutely no idea how difficult or stressful it would be. And what I found myself doing as part of a small group was basically building from nothing a law firm. You had to get premises, stationery, authorization, clients, just we had nothing, literally nothing. And the naivety on my part, I think, is looking back. I mean, I was a great deal younger then. Looking back was kind of staggering. But we didn't really, we went for it. And it was very, very unpopular, to put it mildly, with the London firms, which culminated in a call from someone who is long retired and could best be nameless, but chaired a thing called the City of London Law Society Insolvency Committee, and rang me up and said, "Well, look, Wilkinson, it's all very well you're going to work for the Americans, but you can't possibly stay a member of the restructuring the insolvency subcommittee of the City of London, solicitors. You're going to have to resign, and we can obviously just terminate you. It's never been done before, but we'd just like to have your resignation letter next week." So the London firms were very hostile and very unsupportive. And now the wheel has gone full circle. But sort of the story of my career, and there are other contemporaries of mine, people like Mike Francis, but partners that left the big London firms in the mid 1990s and basically built the American firms. And that was a long and rocky road. And to be honest, it took way longer than I ever thought it would for the US firms really to build the presence they have now. But look at them now. I mean, it's just, you spend time in the US firms too. I mean, it's been extraordinary, but it's been a long, it's a 30-year, process to build those firms.
Yeah.
So I went to Cadwallader, and, it was not plain sailing in the sense that I was teamed up with a group of people, I think all of whom left, not in restructuring, I hasten to add, but they all left. So it was kind of just me. And actually, I will just tell one, I hope, slightly amusing story, which is, I think, probably about 1999 or something. I got into the office, I sat down at my desk. There was a massive pile of envelopes on my chair. And it was, "Dear Wilkinson, please accept this notice of my resignation, yours, X." And I went through them all, and the entire legal staff remaining in the office resigned. And I thought, oh, God, I finished. This is my end of my career. I'm going to have to, I'm going to call my father up and tell him I'm coming back to Liverpool to be a lawyer. And I then rang my wife up and said, "Look, it's all over. The entire team has resigned." And she said, "You idiot, look at your calendar. It's the 1st of April. And then I thought, it is the 1st of April. And then outside my door, they were all standing, "Oh, I got you." So there was that going on. But anyway.
I think I recall that, actually.
You may have resigned. You may have been in that. Yeah, you might have included you.
Wasn't there a fake kind of legal business mock-up page done or something? It was done pretty well. But I mean, look, it clearly, you're being self-depreciating, because it was incredibly successful. And so I joined, I think it's sort of early 2000s, where I think about 88% of European high yield bonds had defaulted. It's basically, there were two types of industry, and one was electricity, one was telecoms. They both defaulted pretty much at the same time. And you were absolutely right at the center of that. I mean, was that a sort of lucky break, or did you sort of position yourself in a way to pick up all of that work?
Look, I think it was luck, in the sense that the plan kind of came good. So, when we started, the restructuring, market was basically divided up into the lawyers, the existing lawyers that would tend to act for the company, and there was no process then to sort of change lawyers. The company's lawyers would stay the company's lawyers. Then you'd have the lawyers that work for bank creditors, the big London firms who work for the banks, and the banks were absolutely, all over debt restructuring. And then there was a sort of, potentially, if there was someone else in the capital structure, so potentially bonds, they weren't lawyered up. So really the sort of the pond that you could fish in were the bondholders. And in the early days, the London firms would say, "Oh, look, Wilkinson, it'll never be successful. He only works for bondholders." And I remember writing it down, thinking they might live to regret that. But to begin with, it was slow, and then, great good fortune, the European high yield market basically went bust. And the scale of that is hard to imagine. I mean, in those days, the European high yield market, and these were the early days of the market, was basically used as a kind of large venture capital. They were funding the building of the cable networks, for example, and the energy companies. People could get what would probably at least be in part a sort of private equity capital raise. In those days, it was high yield bonds. So NTL, I think it's something like 20 billion. And these what would that be in today's money? Maybe 35 billion. So really big defaults, and there were lots of them. So if you got into the first few, it's critical. You sort of got hard on the first few, but once you had that, then you were the go-to firm for bond restructuring. And those days, people hadn't done it. People had no idea how to go about doing a high yield restructuring. And I remember when so Houlihan came to London, and they started with a joint venture with Close Brothers, and Peter Marshall and Joe Swanson sat down and said, how are we going to do this? I mean, how do you actually go about doing a European high yield restructuring? So going back to the point I made at the beginning, I know we'll use a scheme of arrangement. And then things like, how do you deal with voting, class issues, all the issues that, now are regarded as standard. Costs, the idea that you assemble a bond group and then say, oh, by the way, as part of the restructuring, you've got to pay their costs. That was shocking to lawyers acting for the company in the mid-1990s. So, part of your time is, negotiating things that now would be completely standard and everyone accepts. We were sort of trying to make up a process as we went along and developed the scheme, and, it fitted perfectly that insurance company model, because, of course, the governing law is not English. Mainly it's New York law. You've got, then it was a unanimous consent, documentary consent to restructure the bonds. You had to have some sort of process. So the majority could deliver the minority, and you had to make it bind creditors in the place that mattered, which was the states. So the insurance company model with US creditors fitted perfectly. So, I had an idea. It was kind of, the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I had an idea, and then suddenly we had a business. And then it was a lot of, go to New York, talk to bond committees, get hard on these deals. And I was lucky because we had a really very, very good team. The names, you were part of that team, and there was a diaspora. Eventually there was diaspora from Cadwallader of lots of restructuring lawyers. But if I could reassemble that team, we'd have just it was a superb set of.
Yeah,
I was very lucky that he did. I was very lucky he didn't all resign, and then we had a.
Yeah, how did that? I mean, how did you find that talent? Or was it? I mean, it was a very kind of special moment in the market where there was so much going on. One firm had sort of grabbed so much market share. How did you sort of get that team together? And
if I explained it now,
working and recruiting must be so tough.
Yeah, well, look, if I explained it now, you're absolutely right. And the very established firms were obviously recruiting and were very sniffy about the American firms. So it was hard to persuade people coming into the profession from a traditional route to move to the American firms initially. And so what we did, and if I did this now, my HR people would be sort of head in their hands and stopping me doing recruiting. But it'd be varied. So you had some people that would sort of walk in through the door and say, "I really want to do what you do. I'm moving my family to London. I've learned all about it. It's incredibly interesting. Give me a job." And I would go, "Yeah, fine. Sounds. If you're prepared to do that, good. I'll back you." And that more often than not, worked out. And then the other route was, so a very good Australian friend, Nick Dunstan. So you must have overlapped with Nick. And Nick was really one of the first associates I had. He was just fantastic. But eventually he really did resign. I said, no, I've just got to go back to Australia. I'm married, we're going to have children, bring the family up. And I sort of begged him, said, no, he said, oh, no, I'm going. I said, well, look, just do me one thing before you go. I need you to go to Australia, just hire 3 lawyers. And he said, well, do you want to interview them? I said, oh, not really, no. I said, if you like them, we'll hire them. So he went to Australia. And I thought, I won't give you their names, because some of them are now in very eminent positions. In fact, they're all in, I think, very eminent positions in other law firms. And turned out to be incredibly good. So I just, when you see someone really good, you just hire them. And we were lucky, because very good people turned up.
Yeah. And I also think you were, I think you just tried people. If they just weren't the right fit, they weren't the right fit. I mean, it's probably, as you say, I'm not sure if in today's HR world it would work, but you were in that really difficult spot. I wanted to move a little bit, because what I'd like to ask you, like whenever I'm asked what you do, and I say, oh, I do restructuring. Not if you're outside of this world, it's sometimes a bit hard to describe what it is that we do. And how do you describe restructuring other than it when you see it, which is the famous definition?
No, I think that's a good. I think that's a good question. You do have to be able to say in a sentence. If you're talking to someone at a dinner party, you'd say in a sentence what they do before their eyes glaze over and they move on to a different topic of conversation. But I think what we do, I think we do 2 things actually. One is, and this was not my expression, but I think in the very early days, I think one of the American bankruptcy lawyers, possibly Harvey Mellett, said something like, the problem with this company, it's a perfectly good company, but it's got a completely inappropriate capital structure. And I always remember that expression and thought, yeah, well, that's kind of what we do. So you take a company, and to be restructured, it has to be viable. So you equip it with an appropriate capital structure. And that's the first thing that we do. And that's a debt restructuring. So, equipping a viable business with an appropriate capital structure. I think there's a second thing that from time to time in our careers as restructuring lawyers, we end up doing, which is actually, it's not a business that can be saved, but you've got a pool of assets, and the job is over time or quickly, you've got to work out how to distribute those assets, collect in assets, monetize them, and distribute them. So liquidation, but people may not want to do it through a liquidation. And kind of the insurance company jobs are a bit like that, because they weren't writing new business, but they had over many years, decades probably, to kind of crystallize the claims of policyholders and then collect on their reinsurance. Lehman falls into that category. If in the future date there's what happens to frozen Russian sanctioned assets, that's that. You've got a pot of assets, and it could be a range of different things. You have to work out how you distribute them, and I think that's the second thing that we do. We probably do a bit less of that than the first one, the equip a company with an appropriate capital structure.
And what I think the thing that appealed to me about restructuring as a lawyer is that you probably have a little bit more say in a deal than if you're a banking lawyer where you're just told by the client, right, go and do this, and you kind of do what you're told, whereas you're a bit more of a sort of role in strategic planning. Maybe you could talk about that role and how you've managed to do that in your career.
Yeah, I think that might have been the thing that attracted when I went to the States in the 1990s and saw American bankruptcy lawyers, and these were then the stars of the industry. They were very colorful characters, and they had a remit that was way beyond what any lawyer in London I'd ever seen do. They were populating the boards of companies, determining terms of remuneration, just doing, pulling a deal together. And I just thought, that looks great fun. And, by that stage, I think my neighbor in probably, I think, also partly Clifford Chance, actually. He was a securitization lawyer. And I don't mean to be down on securitization lawyers, but, every day was just wading through this sort of mass of documentation, and he was sort of amending this, slightly amending. And I just thought, I just do not ever want to do that. I'm sorry. I quite like restructuring them if something goes wrong. But this seemed a sort of, a remit that was incredibly interesting. And I do think that the world of restructuring, because normally people are less familiar with, the process, what's likely to happen. So much of it will depend upon judgment calls about a whole series of big issues that, you see a range of issues, and you have an ability to be an advisor in a way that I think is rare for a lawyer. So I've been very lucky. I found that mix of law and commercial, and applying the law to the facts in front of you, and then advising the client on the way forward and dealing with those issues is super interesting. So I think as lawyers in restructuring, it doesn't suit everybody, but I think we're very lucky. I think we've had actually it makes for an incredibly interesting career, which is why I'm doing it for 40 years.
I mean, I totally agree. And what I realise is there's so often in these deals sliding doors moments where you could go down a completely different route. And going back to sort of the banking securitization lawyer, he or she is either doing a securitization or they're not. I mean, sometimes they may tweak it. But how have you, do you participate very fully in some of the more commercial aspects of, you could do this or that? Or do you sort of think, well, there are just bits where that's not my expertise, I'll leave it to somebody else, I'll get somebody else involved? Or how have you sort of dealt with that? Because you're usually in a restructuring, there's a void, and then the first voice that comes in that's powerful is often the direction of travel.
Look, it does depend on the client, but I would say that now in most cases, and I think partly because of the experience that I had at Goldman, when I had 8 years not being a lawyer, I think, and people who know me normally say, well, Andrew's probably got a view. So I think on most issues, if I don't necessarily have an answer, I'll have an idea how to get an answer. And if it isn't from me, I'll probably know, who the best person is to talk about that. And I think that the financial advisors and the lawyers work, more hand in glove, and there's no sort of monopoly on who's got one set of issues, who's got another set of issues. That it's everyone working as best they can to get restructuring over the line. And I think what's quite good about restructuring, because at the end of the day, normally deal has to get done, just has to get done, company has to be saved, and people are allowed to get on with their lives. So that sort of, look, this just must happen. And the question is, how do we get it to happen? And that's not true of many other areas, actually. Companies can buy other companies, or they cannot. There's always some alternative route to go down. But with the debt restructuring, you either save the company or it fails, and an awful lot of people lose their livelihoods, and people get sacked.
And how have you? It's often a situation where, as you say, it's people losing their livelihoods, possibly shareholders losing their investment, banks, the bankers worrying about write-downs. It's very emotional, very charged, and also often a lot of aggression and emotion. How have you dealt with that? Do you enjoy the aspects of the business of negotiating? Because I have sat there, I've been in meetings with you where it's been very, very fraught, and I almost get the feeling you probably enjoy it a little bit.
Look, I think I think as you get older, more experience, your sort of style changes. So in the 1990s and probably through into the 2000s, certainly pre-Goldman, bearing in mind that the sort of clients of the bondholders themselves, depending who they were, if they're sort of secondary investors in those days, could be also pretty pugnacious. And we were coming into deals very much as the kind of outsiders. And banks didn't want them there. They weren't interested in distressed investors. They just had, a lot of, negative views from propaganda about them, didn't see them as alternative sources of capital, just saw them as a thorough nuisance. And we were sort of generally, my clients and I were generally just not welcome at the party. And I think that bred a certain sort of us versus them. And, in those days, we were not working for companies mainly. So, things were quite tough, and we certainly had some very difficult deals. And I had clients that were sort of climbing over the furniture to sort of either tackle other people in the committee or so it was. Now looking back, it was probably incredibly stressful. But I've never been someone that gets stressed. I sleep. I've always been able to shut, to go home. I shut it all off and I don't worry about it. And that's an important. There are people either like that or they're not like that.
Well, I do think, Andrew, that when you're at the top of the tree, it's sometimes easier to be the one who sort of has the vision, and there may be other people who are sort of worried around the edges, but you need that clarity of mind to operate, which you clearly had.
Well, I was going to say something about that actually, because I'm not necessarily sure about that. I mean, I think that so I have friends that as lawyers are kind of perfectionists. Their view is that look, we've got to make sure the deal is properly papered and go through every clause, and they're extremely thorough, absolutely superb lawyers. But when they're sort of the deal is done and the agreements are signed, then they worry, oh God, we should put this in, we should have put that in, maybe it's not perfect. And restructuring is absolutely not the place for those people to be practicing. Because I think the approach in restructuring is, look, it's got to get done. And if it spends 6 months getting it done perfectly, or you spend 3 months getting it done, it's better to get it done. And of course, what goes with that is you've got to be able to get the things that are critical, work out of the 1,000 points you could be worrying about, the probably 10 that matter. And you've got to fix you've got to fix the 10, and then fix the 10. You don't go to sleep until you fix the 10. Once you've got the really key points done, you get the deal done. And the rest is I don't mean to dismiss it. And for lawyers, obviously, detail is important. It has to be right, but it's also got to get done, and done within a reasonable time frame. Yeah. And I do think that that's one of the things that over the years has changed. I sort of talked in the 90s about Cadwell days, we were running around with a sort of notebook and a pen, doing restructuring work. And I always thought, look, let's just write the deal down in a term sheet and get people to agree it. And then the job is to paper it as quickly as you possibly can. And where we are now, I think, is, obviously there are, more lawyers, professionals, processes have got more complicated, but it is vastly more complicated. And I do think that there has always been in restructuring a real danger of missing the wood for the trees. The things that you really got to make sure get done sometimes don't get done because people get obsessed with the wrong things. And that ability to step back and say, look, actually, just write on a piece of paper the things we just got to do in this deal. That needs experience, and being able to take a view. And I've always, going back to one more story which I'll give you, but going back to the sort of deal you worked on, actually, having the nerve in a meeting, doesn't matter how many people there, whether it's incredibly senior people from the government, whatever it is, you've got to be not afraid to say, forgive me for asking this question, can we just check that and then get your point out? Because that actually came to a head on British Energy. So this is restructuring of what was then the publicly owned, meaning not the government, but a public company, the British nuclear fleet, and it had to go into restructuring. And there was kind of one absolutely critical point, is the deal hinged on the government taking responsibility for the liabilities of decommissioning of the nuclear fleet, British Energy couldn't remotely afford it. And the idea was that the government was setting up a fund, the government would be responsible for the decommissioning costs. So that's the deal. It's one of the big London firms. There were hundreds of lawyers, and we were all in the basement of their enormous offices, and people have been working around the clock, and the deal's getting ready to be signed. And then I turned out, I said, just show me that bit in the contract that says, so far as the company is concerned, just passes through all decommissioning costs to the government. And everyone goes, yeah, that's the deal. I said, well, just show me that bit in the contract that's written down. Where's that written down? There was a very long silence. And then actually the government's lawyer at the usual firm said, you know what, that's a really good point. Where is it? And we all go, oh shit. I said, look, if we walk out of this room without it written down, everybody's getting sued. We just have to, how could, but it's a very good example. Look, people miss stuff, but the ability to sort of sit in the room and say, can we just check we got this bit done? Don't be afraid to ask that. It doesn't matter. Everyone says, oh yeah, it's all covered, you daft old fool. Or it may not be. And it's quite surprising actually how often what you think is sort of clear and understood, when you actually look at it again before you sign something, it may not be quite as clear as you would like it to be. And that's a lesson. I'd learn that. I'm not afraid. I'll ask anything. I'm not afraid to sort of put my hand on the neck. Let's just check this.
I felt like that's probably one of the things I learned, working with you. It's actually sometimes the stupid question or the obvious point. It's almost socially embarrassing to raise it, but actually, as you say, if you haven't got it sorted, you're in trouble. So I wanted to move a little bit on to, I guess the in America they've got Chapter 11, and that's worked very well. Over here in Europe, particularly it's been sort of made a bit difficult with Brexit, which has changed things as well. But what do you think of the landscape at the moment for European restructuring in terms of legal frameworks?
I'm a bit concerned about it, to be honest. And to put this in context, for a very long time, I have been pushing the idea of a kind of, European Chapter 11. And I understand that given the issues around harmonization of of Europe's capital markets, and particularly now that we've got Brexit, the chances of a pan-European Chapter 11 have diminished in recent times. But I think it's sort of, a strong company-driven restructuring process across Europe is, I've always thought that's a very important thing. Now, the UK government really for a very long time was pretty resistant to that idea, based on a view, I think, largely that would have a negative impact on the costs of borrowing. And it's very difficult to be clear exactly whether that is that right, is that wrong, but that I think was the long-standing concern. This debate has been going on for decades. Now, so when we then hit the pandemic, I think the government very quickly came to the idea that we really should do something to streamline the restructuring process. And of course, the scheme was good as far as it went, but there were lots of things that it didn't address. So with the new legislation, Part 27, what we've ended up with is the cram down. And not really a stay. I mean, for the restructurings that you and I work on, we do not have a practical way of achieving a stay. But we've got a cram down and a sort of big step towards something that looks a lot more like Chapter 11. But I think the way that the courts are now, approaching the plan, and there were quite lots of things that were sort of left unsaid in the legislation. So it's the job of the restructuring barristers who are now on the bench and or in the Court of Appeal to take that and make it work. But I am concerned that we're sort of falling between two stools, and I think this whole idea of, the counterfactual, what is the relevant alternative, as a matter of fact, it's an incredibly hard thing, for judges to sort of work out what would have happened had the first plan not been, not been sanctioned, because something will happen, and because we all know that something is generally not a liquidation, it'd be another plan probably. So there's that. I think that this sort of factual exercise the courts have to do, to look at what would have happened. I think that's pretty problematic, actually, because I think it leads the court into a sort of an analysis that requires a great deal of time and evidence and speculation. And I think there's a simpler alternative, there's a much better alternative, which is bite the bullet and say to the court, okay, the job, it's value. You work out, what the post-restructuring enterprise value is and how should it be determined. And that will tell you who's in the money and who isn't in the money. But this sort of, you're in the money or out of the money, depending upon this factual analysis of what the alternative is. And then you come back, and now, with Richard Snowden's decision in Adler, I mean, I think as the law stands, he's quite right. But, saying, well, you overlay onto that, are you out of the money in the relevant alternative? But then for those in the money, there has to be a fair allocation of the restructuring surplus. Well, the restructuring surplus is pretty much, you've got to start, well, what is it? How do you work it out? And I think what it is the post-restructuring enterprise value. So I think we're sort of halfway to having a Chapter 11, and I think it would be now better if we just put the missing bits into the legislation and said, okay, how do you value the company? And then you allocate value. And this, I think it just brings us to the absolute priority rule. So you end up, cascades down creditors until their claims get paid, taking into account post-default interest. And I think where we're ending up at the moment, my concern is that we've gone from a scheme process. Look, the great thing about the scheme process is they're incredibly hard to oppose, provided you got your classes right. I mean, every decade, some lawyer would overreach and sort of mess up the classes, but generally, the schemes would go through, and they were pretty simple processes. Now, you needed something else to sort of force a cram down. You needed administration or a security enforcement, or you need the shareholders, to approve a delisting, whatever it was. You'd need something under the scheme, but it was a fairly sort of rough, ready, quick process, and you could get it through the courts in a short period of time. I am concerned that where the law is heading now is we're ending up with a very lawyer-intensive, complex set of proceedings to answer the questions around, what is the restructuring surplus, how does it get distributed, and what's the relevant alternative. So I think that is probably going to be, just much too complicated. And I think I would like the government to finish off the legislation. I would like them to put a stay in. We've got cram down, we've got stay, and I think you may as well go the whole hog and put in, okay, how do we value companies? What does post-restructuring enterprise value? And that is a numbers issue. It is not a what would have happened in some hypothetical counterfactual. It's numbers based, and then you've got capped creditors by reference to the par value of their claim.
I mean, I certainly think that one of the great things about a scheme is you could tell the clients this is going to work. It's you can't say everything is 100%, but certainly not a great situation to sort of spend millions and millions and then find that at the end of the process it gets overturned and you're in a sort of strange situation where, in Adler you've got a scheme that's sanctioned, but then, there's another hearing and, it's all very, very unsatisfactory. But I wanted to, we're almost sort of at a close now. So final question really is what are you working on now? What do you expect to be working on in this year? What are we in a high default environment, low default? How's it work?
Yeah. So look, yes. I mean, I think over the last 12 months, our business, I think our competitors have got steadily busier. We we have a debt analyst now, a Weil, and we produce quarterly a thing called the Weil Distress Index, and try and sort of with some empirical analysis work out whether corporate distress is increasing or decreasing. We're about to put out next quarters, but last quarter, it's been steady quarter on quarter increases, reflecting two things really. One is serious pressure on corporate profitability, and secondly, an adjustment to much higher interest rates. And even if interest rates soften a bit in the next 12 months, I mean, there's no way they're going back to at or close to pandemic or global financial crisis levels. And I think that the wider perspective is that given that Europe's had 12 years on what one of my more indebted partners used to call free money, the era of free money. Borrow as much as you like, you don't have to pay for it. It's now money's not free; it was borrowing costs, and we're in a world where the business world, the corporates are adjusting to that, and there is no doubt there will be fallout from that. And currently, the fallout is being concentrated somewhat in the kind of real estate sector, but there are other sectors too. And I don't see, I think corporate distress will remain at somewhat elevated levels. How many restructurings there are will depend, I think, on the extent to which the financing markets, and in particular the private credit funds, come to the rescue. Companies just refinance with the increased borrowing costs, or in fact, they're going to have to restructure. And look, I think what we've got a range of, we do everything. So the range of deals where we are working for the companies, range of deals where we're working for various stakeholders, be they bondholders or lenders. And then in the last year or so, we do work for some of the big sponsor type clients. So it's a pretty broad spread. I mean, I found that sort of relatively late in my career, I developed, and it's not really a sideline anymore. It's actually quite time consuming, but it's incredibly interesting. I found myself doing quite a lot of sovereign debt restructuring, and that came along in the sort of the mid 2010. So in 2015, I was working on the restructuring of Ukraine, and the sovereign deals are incredibly interesting. The legal piece is less, and there's no doubt it's just less complicated legally than a large corporate restructuring, but the politics and the negotiation process is vastly more complicated, and it's extremely interesting. So we've got 3 or 4 sovereign situations that we're working on, alongside the corporate stuff, and I found that also incredibly interesting. I mean, I think as career develops, you always need a sort of something to learn, new things to think about. I'm sure that corporate restructuring lawyers can add value in sovereign space, just as sovereign restructuring lawyers can add some value in corporate space. And there's increasing sort of crossover, and people thinking about, what does an upside instrument for a sovereign look like, and how do you paper it? So I've got that. So it's been pretty full on, actually. So to go back to your comments at the beginning, I always think my competitors that end up in the Hall of Fame, I think pretty much have retired, but I've got a bit of a way to go. I've still got the sovereign deals to get over the line, and I think a few more years before I'm ready to concentrate on the tennis and the cultivation of olives.
Well, I certainly on the sovereign stuff. I mean, you look at the debt levels, not just of what you might imagine the usual suspects, but France, UK, Italy, etc. I mean, it's not crazy to imagine, unfortunately, some of these bigger economies needing to get restructured. And it's certainly a world I've looked into in a deal I've been working on for some time, which did involve a sovereign, and a sovereign that had a debt outstanding, trying to actually get money out of it. A sovereign's really hard. I mean, we had the sort of very amazing thing where Elliot pursued Argentina for so many years, and they arrested a a naval training vessel, didn't they, at some point? So
Right.
there's a lot to be developed in that area, I would have thought. So I think you're going to have a very, very interesting time doing that. I feel I've stolen enough of your time, Andrew. We've gone a few minutes over what we said, and I almost sort of think if this gets, if my pod gets any traction and people are interested, we might even try and get you back on, because I think there's so much more that we could talk about. But it's been an absolute delight to hear some of your observations, and thank you very much, Andrew, for your time.
Stephen, it's been incredibly kind of you to have me on and massage my ego. If my children ever listen to this, they'll have their head in their hands. Oh God, don't say that to him. He'll, he doesn't need it. But look, yeah. You're very kind. I've really enjoyed it, and very happy to jump on and reconnect on something else whenever you like.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Stephen. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
You've been tuning in to the Turnaround podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, frilibertas.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.